Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. This time we have a podcast instead of a video. My guest today is military expert and also, I should say, friend of mine, Malcolm Nance, who's a long-time military expert. Therefore, I think that it's even better if Malcolm introduces himself. Thanks for joining me today, Malcolm.
It's my pleasure to be on your podcast today. Well, a little about myself. I've spent 36 years in military and civilian intelligence, 20 years in the military, started as a cryptologist, a code breaker, foreign language specialist, moved from signals intelligence into human intelligence. During that time, I was in combat 5 times, including starting in Lebanon in 1983. Just about every country in the Middle East I've been involved in operations in. So Desert Storm, Libya, Syria, Yemen, it's Libya again, and Iraq. I was in Iraq both times for the invasion of Kuwait and then the invasion of Iraq, and worked in and out of Iraq as an intelligence contractor for 10 years. So over 30 years in US intelligence. And a member of the board of the International Spy Museum. I'm also a New York Times bestselling author, written 9 books on terrorism and the Trump-Russia scandal, and just came back from a intelligence assessment of Ukraine and left it 6 hours before they destroyed the airport.
Okay, so of course this interview will be about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So you just mentioned that you've been to Ukraine right before the invasion to assess the situation. Can you tell us something about what you did and what was the outcome of your assessment?
Sure. I'm the executive director of a small think tank. And what we do is we assess asymmetric warfare, because we're called the Terror Asymmetrics Project. And Ukraine seemed to be a very, very good case in point of the kind of asymmetric warfare we suspect was going to happen. And that is when you have a superior power with what appears to be overwhelming military force taking on a smaller group and seeing how this was going to play out. So of course, the most important thing for us, myself and my chief of research, was to get on the ground, study the Russian order of battle, and then literally ride the routes that the invasion would take to see from the perspective of both the offense, how Russia would invade Ukraine, what kind of roads were they going on? Do they have gas stations? What are the crossroads? How are the crossroads situated? And then view it from the perspective of the Ukrainian forces. How would you defend a crossroad? How do you defend a city? So we did that and also evaluated all the evacuation routes. So we went to every major border crossing in southwest Ukraine as well, and spent quite a bit of time in the city of Kyiv, getting to understand the layout of the city and knowing just what an invader would have to do to get into that city. So it was quite comprehensive. We spent 4 weeks doing nothing but running around, either pretending we were the Russians or pretending we were the Ukrainians, and evaluating how the war would go.
Well, recently you've been tweeting a lot about the possibility that Russia actually fails and Ukraine makes it to defeat them. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on this scenario? How can this happen?
Yeah, in fact, I may be the only person in national security media, news media, that believes that the Ukrainians actually have a chance to win the war, and a pretty good chance. The reason being is, if you look at the maps that the news are putting out there, they show big red arrows and show entire sections of Ukraine that are red under Russian control. Well, that's not true at all. Apparently, all Russia controls is the highways that their trucks and tanks are on. They don't control anything to the left. They don't control the fields to the right. They don't even exercise control out into those areas past the length of the length that their weapon system will fire. So in the case of a tank, the most that Russia controls is 2 kilometers to the left, the right, the front, the back of the vehicle. So you have these long columns of vehicles that are taking objectives, whether it's a crossroads like Konotop in the northeastern corner, or the city of Sumy, which the Russians in some instances have bypassed because they met so much resistance. But they're not in the fields. They're not on the secondary roads. They're on these major highways. And they are really having a very tough time. So what Russia thought was going to be a 14-day war where they would seize every centimeter of Ukraine has turned into, right now, I think we're pushing 12 days, where they've barely taken the objectives that most military analysts thought that they would take in the first, day or 2 days. I was always very sanguine about this. I always thought that there was no way that knowing the land, feeling the land, knowing the invasion routes, and of course, the news media forgot about a very important factor here. They rarely ever reported about the Ukrainian army. They have 250,000 men and women. They are very nationalistic. They love their country. They're patriotic. But you have to take into account that the Russians will have to fight them. And so the Russians found out the hard way that there is an army of men and women and civilians that are willing to do anything and do anything to protect their own country. And that's why the Russians are having such a hard time. In fact, I really believe the Ukrainians are allowing the Russians to stretch out in some areas in order to get their lines of communication and their lines of logistics so vulnerable that they can be attacked.
So did the West overrate Russia? Is Ukraine stronger than Putin thought? Or is the West military support actually working?
Yes.
Combination?
The answer to those are all yes. Yes, the West completely overrated Russia. The funny thing is, you look at your opposition and you see the weapon systems that they bought down to Syria, or were selling at the defense conferences like IDEX in the United Arab Emirates. And we got to inspect these weapons, like the Pantsir surface-to-air missile system, or, some of the battlefield weapons, the BMP-3, and, armored personnel carrier. And these are really fearsome weapons. However, one thing that they didn't factor in was the incompetence of the Russian army. And it's one thing to take a few tanks down to Syria and work in a highly scripted zone and use your fighter jets to indiscriminately bomb innocent civilians and destroy hospitals and make it look like you're winning. But this is the Russian army has proven that they have no chain of command that's worthwhile. They fell back on an old Soviet-style system of where only the officers know what's going on. Only officers knew what the objectives were. And we've seen that from numerous prisoner accounts, that they did not brief them until they were in Ukraine, that they were invading Ukraine and were not on an exercise. And only a few officers the night before were aware of this. Well, many of these soldiers don't want to fight Ukraine. So there was one famous case of a reconnaissance platoon that came in near Chernihiv in the north and were immediately captured as they went to a gas station. They saw a gas station, which Ukraine has the best shops in any gas station in the world. I've been all over. You just can't believe the things you can get in these little gas stations. And they wondered why the Ukrainians were shooting at them. When they got captured, they were told, you invaded Ukraine. And they said, no, we're on an exercise in Belarus. The soldiers don't even know what they're fighting for or why they're fighting. And now they're fighting for one reason and one reason only: to survive this invasion. And that is not going to give anyone confidence. Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people are much tougher than anyone gave them credit for. I was down in Donetsk with the senior commander of the Joint Task Force, who had been, commander of these forces that were just 70 meters from the front line. They had been fighting the Russians for years down there and their occupation forces. And this one journalist kept asking him, well, what if the Russians come from the north? What if the Russians come from the south? What if they come from the southwest and Odessa? And this guy just got frustrated. And he said, I don't care what direction they're coming from. I'm going to fight them. And my first thought was, this is the kind of commander that cannot be beaten, right? This guy, he doesn't care. He's a fighter. And everybody that with him is going to feel this passion and they're going to fight. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And finally, the US are giving good logistical support. The European Union's giving good logistical support. For Ukraine to sustain this battle, they need trucks, equipment, ammunition. And we're doing that by providing now some sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, the Stinger missile system. Even Poland has given up, several hundred of the Strela surface-to-air missiles. I know Germany has an inventory of like 3,000 surface-to-air missiles that come from East German stocks. They're like 25, 30 years old, but they work. And that is making life below 10,000 feet unlivable for Russian fighter jets, Russian bombers.
But what would happen in that case?
Down.
Sorry. I'll let you finish. I mean,
no, I'm finished.
In case Ukraine manages to actually defeat the Russians, what's the next phase? Will Putin fall? Maybe because
now you're talking hypotheticals. Yeah, you're talking hypotheticals here. I mean, I've actually heard media people say it's dangerous for Ukraine to win. Well, you don't want to lose, it's too bad. You don't invade other countries. The only hypothetical is that if he starts showing instability, and I read an article today about people that knew him saying that he was easy to insult, irritable, unhappy, sounding just like Donald Trump, right? So, his inner narcissism is creating a problem. But if he decides he wants to become really unstable, like nuking the city of Kyiv, right? At that point, you're going to have to hope that forces inside his government don't follow the orders and relieve him of his command. Whether it's an internal coup, whether it's a violent coup, whether it's a soft coup. But Russia needs to think about Russia. The Russian economy has now been officially destroyed. There was a great piece of video yesterday, that showed over 1,000 workers at a factory striking, and they just walked off and went home. And they did it.
Wow.
Plummeted. The factory could not pay them at all. So they left. So what happens when this starts happening all over Russia? Maybe you get the second 1917 revolution.
So in your opinion, Putin is now threatening to use nuclear weapons, but he can't really use them because it will turn against himself.
Well, these noises he's making, where everything appears to be an act of war. He has Lavrov saying this every day. Giving the Ukrainians any weapons is an act of war. Giving the Ukrainians fighter jets is an act of war. Literally, that's all Lavrov says. And in this circumstance, when he starts making comments like he will he will create devastation that no one has ever seen before and puts his nuclear forces up one level for alert, it's posturing, correct? But what if in his mind, it's not posturing? And though, I'm an ardent anti-nuke, I worked at a nuclear command post, one of those big mountains, that's dug down into the place, and no one goes there and works and believes nuclear weapons can work. They don't. They are just world killers. So, Putin having his forces seize that power plant without regard to whether it melted down. I mean, now you're talking crazy. So is Putin mentally unstable? Does he have a mental defect? I don't know. I'll leave that up to people who are closer to him. But I see his actions, and I have to take them seriously.
Well, in this case, this is one of the very few cases in which we've been warned, because we knew in November that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine. How did intelligence work in this case?
Well, you know, the New York Times wrote an expose a few weeks ago about the Biden administration's activities, related to the run-up to this invasion. And apparently, we had a copy of the entire plan last November. And the first thing that we did was the State Department, the U.S., Secretary of State, and the White House had representatives tell the Russians, we have a copy of your plan. We know what you're doing. Don't forget that this plan started being implemented last March, when lots of Russian forces showed up on the border. And apparently, it was believed at the time that Putin stood down from invading because Joe Biden showed such a hard line. But there weren't enough troops, and that it may have been just positioning for the next year's invasion. So the Biden administration went to Russia, told them we knew about it. The Russians denied it. Then we went to China and told them Russia was going to do something. And we went to China principally so that the Chinese would tell the Russians that we knew, right? Because, Russia and China are very tight. And so telling China is like telling Moscow. And then, of course, we went on this global campaign to expose that this was about to happen and to exploit the intelligence that we had by, for example, knowing that they were going to make a video of a fake video of a massacre, which of NATO troops inside, Donetsk or Luhansk, saboteurs. That video came out and it was laughed at. It was barely distributed. No one cared about it. And because it was ridiculous. So, it was Russia's casus belli, their reason for war, just evaporated. And Putin just decided to do it anyway.
What is in this war the role of fake news, misinformation, Russian propaganda, and so on?
Well, it's very interesting because I think we expected to find a much, much more dramatic Russian use of fake news and misinformation. And what we're finding now is that they're sort of incompetent with it. It's one thing to amplify a series of lies about a US election. It's another thing to try to manufacture an entire war and expect everybody to believe everything that you say. So the Russians haven't been doing very well with that. And that's a good thing, because for the most part, they have fallen back on this behavior that literally it is almost Soviet, right? You can't believe a word. Now Russia Today and Izvestia and all these news channels, News One, they're Pravda again, right? The old Soviet newspaper, which means, it literally means the truth, which everyone my age knew was a lie. Every word of it was a lie. And I think Putin is very surprised by the world's reaction, because he probably was promised that they would do much, much better in terms of information warfare. The only success that they really have is a self-goal by Ukraine. And I spoke to one of the senior ministers about this when the story came out, that Africans were being mistreated at the border, were not being allowed to get on trains. Some people's inner racism was coming out. And I said, this is a dangerous story. This is on day one. I said, this is a dangerous story. You better put out some statements about this and direct the Minister of the Interior to say, no one will be discriminated against. That story's still going a week later. And Russia immediately jumped on it, amplified it. And I get comments from people in Africa and all around the world, Ukrainians are racist, and they believe Russia's version of events. So, but you know what? Ukraine is fighting for its life. So at this point, they shouldn't even bother worrying about that, right? Their entire existence is at threat right now.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts about the possibility of a Ukrainian no-fly zone?
Well, you know, that's off the table for one particular reason, because people need to understand a no-fly zone is a commitment to combat. When we implemented the no-fly zones over Iraq, you know, people don't seem to realize that for 10 years, we were bombing every Iraqi surface-to-air missile site that would turn on. Anytime some guys would get into a anti-aircraft gun emplacement, shoot up a few shots as U.S. fighters went over, we bombed them. Anytime an Iraqi aircraft would take off and come into the protected airspace in northern Iraq of the Kurds, we'd shoot it down. So that's what you'd be asking for. You would be asking for NATO to come in and shoot down Russian Air Force aircraft. Look, to be honest, Ukraine is holding its own. It had over 60 fighter jets, Su-27s and MiG-29s. Granted, I'm sure they've had some attrition. They've lost some in strikes. I know I've seen pictures of shot down Ukrainian MiG-29s. They are engaged in air combat right over the city of Kyiv today. They just lost, I'm trying to remember the young woman's name. Pechova is her last name, but she was the first qualified Ukrainian Air Force MiG-29 fighter pilot, and she was killed in air combat. You know, Russia has a superior, technologically superior, Air Force, but they're not using it because they don't have total air dominance, because they couldn't take out all of the surface-to-air missiles Ukraine had, including systems that Russia sold them, all of them, Russia sold them. And don't forget, those Stinger missiles, the Strela missiles, they're making life below 10,000 feet. You can't fly down there, which means you have to do strikes from very high altitude, which means the S-300 missiles get you. Or, a fighter jet sneaks up on you and shoots you down, like the Ghost of Kyiv, as they're calling this mythical fighter pilot, which probably is like 10 pilots all rolled into one, roll into one myth. So Russia apparently doesn't want to commit the full bulk of its Air Force. And now we're also seeing some of these aircraft did not have advanced avionics like navigation systems. There's a famous photograph I saw just today of an Su-34 strike aircraft with a Garmin GPS, mounted onto the aircraft. And I'm thinking, what? That's what I take when I go camping. It is not what I take when I'm trying to do a precision strike flight, using a $30 million aircraft. There's a lot of inconsistency in this war, which show that Russia is really, really not the country we thought it was.
Well, what is, in your opinion, going to happen next? Are we going at war with Russia?
No, there's no war with Russia coming unless Vladimir Putin loses his mind. Oh, big question. What's he going to use? I understand that most of his surface-to-surface missiles and cruise missiles, 650 battlefield ballistic missiles and cruise missiles have already been launched. He doesn't have the national capacity to create those weapons. For example, he uses the Iskander surface-to-surface missile, which everyone feared. We're finding these missiles were phenomenally inaccurate. They did a strike on a small airstrip at Venezia, which I drove by about maybe 10, 15 days ago. Not even, 12 days. It was the day before the war. And Venezia airstrip was not a sophisticated advanced airstrip. And they hit this thing with 10 battlefield ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. 2 of them hit the runway, but in such a way as the runway was immediately repairable, and the others all missed. And the way that they're striking, it appears that they have this strike schedule so that they don't strike, evaluate with intelligence, restrike. They just put it on the bottom of the list. We'll go back over it 10 days from now. So places are being bombarded at random that don't seem to have any strategic value. So it would be a war with NATO, because NATO would walk right over Russia in a matter of no time. And I think the Russians would roll over for us. They'd want to join NATO.
Of course, they know. They know that the US and NATO can bomb them in 5 minutes, as Ronald Reagan used to say. Yeah. Malcolm, many thanks for your time. Many thanks for your very precious explanations. I'm sure this gave a very interesting insight to all my viewers. And thanks everybody for listening to this. See you all next time. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.